The Germans did come in. And the first thing they did, they rounded up all the Jews. They told all the Jewish people to come to the center of town. You know, in Europe, many of you I'm sure have traveled, every city has like a center of town, you know. So they had the people come there and they had trucks and they trucked us all to a cemetery. And in the cemetery they dug mass graves. They had about 19,000 people in the cemetery at that time, Jewish people. And they killed that day 12 to 13,000 people. Here again, why did I survive? Pure luck. As I mentioned, my first reason I'm here. And the luck is that we got to the cemetery first, or early. The first 6,000 people that got to the cemetery that were in the back were told at the end of the day, when it started snowing, to go home, to leave. Because the Germans wanted to keep a small force of people to work, slave labor. And this is how the ghettos were formed, ghetto. The word ghetto comes from today's world. It means a little differently, but in those days it meant a small part of town was set aside for the Jewish people. A very small part of town. They put very high fences, very hard barbed wire fences all around it so nobody could escape. And they put the 6,000 remaining Jews into this ghetto. Again, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the concentration camps. And there were, you know, perhaps I think there were 13 concentration camps and actually only 6 that had the crematoriums. But there were 350 ghettos spread out all over Europe. And a ghetto was basically just a smaller concentration camp, if you will, because it was an area where people died on a daily basis, where people had nothing to eat, where people died from diseases, from everything else you could think of, and they were all cooped up in a very small area. One short little story about the ghetto. We lived with my grandmother. We lived like with 3 different families in one little room in the ghetto. So my grandmother one day looked out the window and saw Germans coming with dogs. Now my mother was off to work. You know, my mother was young enough where every day she went out of the ghetto and worked on the outside world. What did she do? She cleaned toilets, she washed walls, manual, hard labor. That's what she did. That's what all the Jews did that they marched out of the ghetto outside. Inside the ghetto, there were killings on a daily basis. Anyway, my grandmother saw the dogs coming and Germans, so she grabbed my brother and I, put us into a closet, grabbed a whole bunch of wood, just like you have wood here, this kind of wood, shoved it up against the door of that closet, and sure enough, that saved our lives. Because when the Germans came with their dogs, they couldn't smell the people behind the door. The wood has such a strong smell that saved our lives. So my grandmother was responsible for saving us once that time. And backing up a bit in the cemetery, when they finally quit shooting people in the cemetery, as I mentioned, there were 13,000 people killed. The 6,000 remaining, they told them they could go. So you can imagine pandemonium. Everybody understand what that word means? Mm-hmm. Anyway, mass. Everybody was just like, I was separated from my mother, so was my brother. We were knocked down, we were unconscious. My grandmother was knocked down, but she kind of revived herself and started looking around the area. And actually she was looking for a scarf because it was very cold. And she had lost her scarf. And as she looked for this, she found me, revived me, and she kept looking. She found George, my brother, and took us home. My mother was separated, and she was told that we had already left, otherwise she wouldn't have left. But there was no way to get back. There was 6,000 people moving in that direction, you know. So in the ghetto, life was terrible. We had nothing to eat. In fact, I always tell the kids that when I give a lecture to, I was hungry from 39 to 1945. Now they always say, you know, no, I did eat, obviously, but I was hungry. My biggest drive during all the 6 years was food, and that was true for all of us, really. When the war ended, again, I'm going a little bit not chronologically, you could actually count every bone in my body. You've seen the pictures from people from concentration camps. That's what I look like. I mean, just bare. So back to the ghetto. My mother had met a man in the ghetto. He became my stepfather, and he actually raised me from like 6 years of age till, you know, he died just about 6, 7 years ago. And so did my mother, actually about 10 years ago. But anyway, they had heard that they were going to eliminate everybody in the ghetto. So my mother decided she must escape. She did what Jews do at that time. She went to the rabbi. There was a rabbi there. She said, what should I do? My mother is here. I have 2 boys. And the rabbi wisely told her, don't worry about anything, save the kids. You must save the children. That's what counts. So you must figure out an escape with the children. And your mother must remain here. So she and her girlfriend made a scheme where actually when she walked out of the ghetto gates, I walked under her skirt, literally under her skirt. My brother walked under her girlfriend's skirt. You know, don't forget, a lot of people walking, they put themselves in the middle, and we got to the place where they worked. She put us into a closet and said, stay there till night, and at night she came to get us. Usually I stop here and ask kids, or ask parents, you all have kids, right? Can you imagine having a 6-year-old that's quiet all day? You know, I have 3 kids. So when they were growing up, I kind of wondered about that. How's that possible? I can't keep them quiet for 5 minutes. And here I was quiet in that closet for all day till she got me out, my brother and I, not a peep out of us. The fear of death, the fear of the moment, makes kids even do things that seem impossible. But, you know, it happens. So we escaped. That's how we escaped. And we lived, once we escaped, we lived as Gentiles. I went to church every Sunday. We had a Christmas tree if we could afford to find some tree to put in our house. We did things just as the Poles do, to live like the Poles. We moved probably, without exaggeration, 50, 75 times during this time, because we're always afraid that somebody might find out that we were Jewish, and the Poles were very suspicious of people, and the Poles did tell the Germans where the Jews lived, or where they were. That was one of the things. Many of them helped, many of them didn't help. So we basically moved a lot. In fact, my mother at one point decided there was no way she was going to survive with these 2 kids. And my brother looked very, so to say, Jewish, which means he had dark eyes, black hair, had the very dark hair. And in those days in Poland, that was what was known as a Jewish look, okay? So she decided she wanted to have somebody take care of us. You may have read many, many stories today how people, how children survive the war by being placed in Catholic homes and so on. And that is true. Many, many children did survive the war that way. But, so she found a person that would take us in, my brother and I. And since I mentioned to you we had all this wealth, we also have properties in Poland. So she signed over a property to these people, they were farmers near Krakow, that if they kept my brother and I through the war, they would keep a building for him and a building for me. You know, a 4-story apartment building. Well, they made a legal contract, everything was done properly. However, we stayed there. About a month after we stayed there, we went to church every Sunday. My brother went to church with me and the family, and he forgot to take his hat off.